Fremont County, Wyoming, July 11, 1850. Mid-morning, the mountain still cold at this elevation. Jonas Ree was 38 years old and had been working mining claims in the Wind River Range since 1847, one of the first non-Indian men in the territory to push into the interior mountains in search of placer gold rather than following the established emigrant routes along the river valleys below. He was from Kentucky originally and carried with him the Appalachian miner's instinct for high ground, the conviction, developed through generations of mountain work, that the richest deposits announced themselves in the way the rock changed color at certain altitudes, and that the men who followed the elevation rather than the water were the men who found what the easy country had already given up. He had been wrong about this more often than he had been right, and he was running low on provisions and on confidence when he and his three-man crew, a Lenape guide named Thomas Painted Horse, 24, and two Pennsylvania miners named Samuel Colby and Aaron Vickers, 31 and 26 respectively, put a charge into a granite outcrop in the upper Wind River Range on the morning of July 11, 1850. The charge brought down the face, and with it, a section of granite shelf that had been sealing an opening they had not known was there. The opening was roughly oval, approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, and the air that came out of it when the dust settled had the quality that sealed air always has, the quality of stillness that does not belong to a mountain morning. Jonas Ree noticed it before the smoke had fully cleared. He noticed it because he had grown up in the Kentucky mountains and had spent 3 years in the Wind River Range and had never once encountered a sealed space in natural granite that produced air with this quality. Dry, cool, and carrying a smell he could not name, but that Thomas Painted Horse named immediately. Painted Horse said one word. He said it in Lenape, and then he said it in the English he had learned at the Methodist Mission School in Kansas. He said, Nimerigar. But here is what the United States Army's Topographical Corps has spent 174 years making sure you never ask about. The Wind River Range in July 1850 was not terra incognita to the federal government. The Army's Corps of Topographical Engineers had conducted surveys of the major river valleys in the previous decade, and the emigrant trails that passed through the lower Wind River country were well enough established that the Army maintained occasional patrol presence. What the Army did not have was any formal survey of the interior mountain terrain above the placer gold elevation, the high granite country where Jonas Ree and his crew had been working for 3 years without seeing a federal official. They were operating in a legal and administrative vacuum, and when Ree's charge brought down the granite shelf on the morning of July 11th, there was no institutional structure in the immediate vicinity to respond to what it revealed. The institutional response arrived later, and from a direction Ree had not expected. The opening led into a passage approximately 8 feet long that opened into a chamber. The chamber was natural in its overall form, a granite void created by the same tectonic processes that shaped the Wind River Range, but not entirely natural in its interior. The floor had been leveled. Not dramatically leveled, not to the precision of the dressed stone floors that would later be documented at sites in Missouri and Pennsylvania, but leveled to a consistency that the unworked stone around it did not show, a flat surface in a rounded cavity, produced by someone scraping the high points of the natural floor to create a workable horizontal. The walls of the chamber had been treated as well, not cut or dressed, but smoothed at a height of approximately 4 feet above the leveled floor, as though the wall had been rubbed repeatedly over a long period by something soft. In the chamber, on the leveled floor, arranged in a single layer across its full extent, were 12 figures. They were not standing, they were lying, each positioned on its back, each with the arms at the sides, each oriented with the head to the north. They were mummified. The conditions of the sealed granite chamber, dry, cold, stable, had preserved them with a completeness that made them, in Ree's later account, look like sleeping children. They were not children. They were adults. Each was between 12 and 18 inches in length. Jonas Ree's account of the Wind River discovery exists in 3 forms. The first is a letter he wrote to his brother in Louisville, Kentucky, in August 1850, approximately 6 weeks after the discovery. This letter is in the Filson Historical Society's collection in Louisville, donated by the Reese family in 1901, under the designation Reese Family Papers, Box 1. The second is a deposition given to the Army Topographical Corps Survey Team that arrived in Fremont County in September 1850, 2 months after the discovery. The third is a statement given to a Methodist minister named Elias Stone in Pinedale, Wyoming, in 1871, 21 years after the discovery. Only the first form is accessible. The Army deposition is in the Army Corps records held at the National Archives, and a Freedom of Information request filed in December 2019 by the researcher Ellen Park, requesting all Army Topographical Corps records for Fremont County, Wyoming, for the period 1848 through 1855, received a response providing general survey documents, but citing Exemption 1, National Security Classification, for records specifically related to the July 1850 survey. The Methodist minister Elias Stone's records are held at the Wyoming Methodist Conference Archive in Casper and are accessible to researchers, but the 1871 statement is not in the Stone papers. The conference archivist's note in the finding aid indicates that certain documents were removed from the Stone collection by a federal representative in 1952. The August 1850 letter to his brother is the core document. In it, Reese describes the 12 figures with the precision of a man who handled material properties for a living. He gives their length as between 12 and 18 inches. He measured with his handspan, which he calibrates in the letter as 9.5 inches, meaning the smallest figure was approximately 1 handspan plus a quarter, and the largest was approximately 2 handspans less a fraction. He describes the facial features as old, not a child's face, but an old person made very small, with lines at the corners of the eyes and a heaviness to the brow that I have seen in old men. He describes the hands as each finger distinct, the nails still present. He describes the positioning as deliberate. They had been placed, not fallen. Each one lay the same way, head north, arms along the body, as a person might lay a child down to sleep who expected to return. He spends 2 paragraphs on the face of the smallest figure, which he examined most closely. He writes that the expression was not peaceful, which is what he had expected from a mummified face in a sealed chamber. He writes that the expression was watchful, that the preserved features, which showed the lines and heaviness of age, had the quality of a face looking at something rather than a face at rest. Thomas Painted Horse, the Lenape guide, refused to enter the chamber. He stood at the opening and looked in and said Nimerigar again, and would not move from the entrance. He had been born in Kansas and raised at a Methodist mission school, but the Lenape oral tradition of the Nimerigar had come to him through his grandmother, who had come to Kansas from Pennsylvania in the removal years of the 1820s and who had told him, in the evenings of his childhood, about the small, dangerous people who lived in rocks. His grandmother had called them Nimerigar and had described them as a people apart, not a supernatural creation, but a physical people who had been in the rocks before the Lenape, who were there before any nation the grandmother could name, who were old in a way that the mountains were old. Painted Horse stood at the entrance and said their name and would not enter. Samuel Colby and Aaron Vickers entered the chamber with Reese. Colby, the older of the 2 Pennsylvania miners, measured his own hand against the face of the largest figure. His palm covered it. The figures were adult in proportion. Reese is explicit about this in the letter, noting that they were not children made small, but adults of a different scale, with the faces and hands of old people in the body of an infant. Vickers counted them. 12. He counted them twice. 12 was the number both times. The crew spent 32 minutes in the chamber. Then Reese told them to go back to the surface. He took no figure with him. He took nothing. He had been in mining long enough to understand that disturbing a sealed site before you understood what you were looking at was a way of destroying the only evidence of what it contained. He sealed the opening as best he could with loose stone from the blast debris, took a compass bearing and a triangulated distance from a prominent rock formation above the site, wrote both in his field journal, and went back to his provisions camp. He reported the find to the Army survey team that arrived in Fremont County in September 1850. The survey team was led by a lieutenant named Charles Bowen, 29 years old, fresh from West Point, and detailed to the Topographical Corps for his second assignment. Reese gave Bowen the compass bearing and the triangulated distance and offered to guide the survey team to the site. Bowen took the bearing and the distance and said the team would visit the site before the month was out. He took Reese's deposition on the following day. The Army survey team departed Fremont County in October 1850. Reese never received any communication from the Army about the site. The Army deposition is classified under Exemption 1, National Security. The Wind River Shoshone oral tradition is the second pillar of this case. Dmitry Shimkin's fieldwork with Wind River Shoshone elders in the 1930s, which produced the Nimerigar documentation published in the American Anthropologist in 1947, described the small people as a population that the Shoshone had encountered in the physical world, not a spirit tradition, but a memory tradition. The Wind River Shoshone remembered them as dangerous, as inhabiting the high rocky terrain, as predating the Shoshone's own occupation of the range. Jonas Ree's 1850 find, in the high rocky terrain of the Wind River Range, at an elevation above the standard placer working area, in a sealed granite chamber with a leveled floor and smooth walls, containing 12 mummified adult figures between 12 and 18 inches in length. This is not a find from the mythological register. This is a find from the same physical world that the Shoshone elders were describing when they told Shimkin about the small people who lived in rocks. The two records, the oral tradition documented in the 1930s and the letter written in 1850, are describing the same physical reality from opposite directions in time. The oral tradition looks back across generations. The letter looks forward from the moment of encounter. They describe the same small people in the same rocky range in the same sealed space context. Both records are in accessible archives. The 12 figures they both describe are not. The site of the 1850 discovery in the Wind River Range can be triangulated from the bearing and distance in Reese's field journal. The field journal is not in the Filson Historical Society's collection. The August 1850 letter to his brother is in the collection. The letter references the field journal and indicates that the bearing and distance are in it, but does not reproduce them. Reese describes the prominent rock formation above the site as a peak that splits at the top like a man's two fingers held up, visible for 10 miles in clear weather. A rock formation matching this description exists in the upper Wind River Range at an elevation consistent with the placer working area Reese describes. The Bureau of Land Management's land records for the relevant section show a restricted access notation added to the parcel in 1952. The restriction type is listed as Federal Mineral Withdrawal. No mineral development has occurred on the parcel since the restriction was added. A Freedom of Information request filed in February 2021 by the researcher David Park, requesting the basis for the 1952 mineral withdrawal on the parcel, received a response citing Exemption 1. National Security, again, for a mineral withdrawal in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, added in 1952. The same year that the stone papers were visited by the federal representative in Casper. The 12 figures that Jonas Ree described as lying on the leveled floor in the watchful posture of those placed by someone who expected to return have been in that chamber since before Ree was born, and the 1952 federal interest in the access restriction suggests that whatever the Army survey team found when they visited the site in September or October of 1850 was of sufficient significance to warrant a classification that has remained in place for 73 years. The chamber is in the high rocky terrain of the Wind River Range. The prominent rock that splits like two fingers is visible for 10 miles in clear weather. The restriction has been in place since 1952. The 12 figures have been in the chamber since before any of this. The comparative framework for the Wind River find requires looking at 3 other documented sites in the same geographical corridor. The Pedro Mountains find of 1932, 82 years after Reese's discovery, produced a single figure in a sealed granite cavity in the Carbon County Range, approximately 100 miles south of the Wind River Range. The Pryor Mountains find of 1932, concurrent with the Pedro Mountain discovery, produced a system of chambers in the Montana Range, approximately 150 miles north of Wind River. Jonas Ree's 1850 find sits geographically between these two later discoveries, in the same high granite country, at the same sealed cavity context, with figures in the same 12 to 18-inch range. 3 sites, 1 corridor, 1 geological type, sealed granite, high elevation, dry interior, spread across a north-south distance of approximately 250 miles. The Wyoming-Montana granite corridor appears to have been an inhabited territory, or a burial territory, or a repository, for a population whose physical scale placed them entirely outside the documented range of any human or hominid population in the North American record. That corridor has been the subject of federal mineral withdrawal designations, Army deposition classifications, and Bureau of Indian Affairs access restrictions across a period of 124 years. The restrictions have not been lifted. The sites have not been excavated by any publicly disclosed archaeological program. The Nimerigar tradition that Thomas Painted Horse's grandmother carried from Pennsylvania to Kansas to the memory of a 24-year-old guide on a Wind River mining crew in 1850 is the oldest documented oral record of the population. The 12 figures that Ree described as watchful in their sealed chamber are the oldest documented physical encounter with them in the American record. Both are in accessible archives. Neither has been followed by any institutional action that has produced a publicly accessible result. Jonas Ree left the Wind River Range in the autumn of 1850, shortly after giving his deposition to Lieutenant Charles Bowen's survey team. He went to Salt Lake City and worked in the Utah Territory through the 1850s and early 1860s. He returned to Kentucky in 1865 and died in Louisville in 1882. His brother's family donated the Ree family papers to the Filson Historical Society in 1901. The August 1850 letter is in Box 1. The field journal, which would contain the bearing and triangulated distance to the site, is not in the collection. The donation inventory, on file at the Filson Historical Society, lists the field journal as present in the donated materials. A notation in the Society's accession records, dated 1903, indicates that one item from the Ree donation was transferred to a federal institution at the request of the Department of the Interior. The transferred item is not identified by title in the notation. The field journal is not in the collection. The Department of the Interior holds the bearing and the distance. The Wind River site is behind the mineral withdrawal restriction. The prominent rock that splits like 2 fingers is visible for 10 miles in clear weather. The 12 figures are on the leveled floor, with the head to the north and the arms at the sides, and the watchful faces that Jonas Ree spent 2 paragraphs describing in a letter to his brother in Louisville in August 1850. And they have been there since before Ree's grandmother was born. The Lenape oral tradition that Thomas Painted Horse carried to the Wind River Range in 1850 has a specific geographic provenance. The Lenape had their ancestral territory in the river valley of what is now Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. The removal period of the 1820s and 1830s displaced them westward through Ohio, Indiana, and eventually Kansas, where Thomas Painted Horse was born. The Nimerigar tradition that Painted Horse's grandmother carried from Pennsylvania to Kansas was therefore originally a Pennsylvania tradition, a memory of small, dangerous people living in rocky terrain in the eastern mountains, carried westward by displacement and arriving in the Wind River Range by the coincidence of one woman's grandson taking work as a mining guide. The Lenape grandmother's memory of the Nimerigar was a memory of the Appalachian Range, not the Rockies. When Painted Horse recognized the sealed granite chamber in the Wind River country as a Nimerigar place, he was applying an Eastern tradition to a Western setting and finding that it fit. This has a specific implication. If the Lenape tradition of the Nimerigar originated in the Appalachian Range, if the small people who lived in rocks were a memory of encounters in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or New York before the removal, Then the Wind River Range finds and the Appalachian Range finds documented in the 1879 and 1880 Pennsylvania cases are not geographically isolated incidents. They are part of a continental distribution. The same small people in the same sealed rocky spaces appear in the Appalachian Range and the Rocky Mountain Range and the plateau ranges between them, across a geographic span of more than 2,000 miles, in the oral traditions of populations from both coasts, and in the physical discoveries of mining crews from Missouri to Wyoming to Montana. The distribution is not uniform. The documented finds cluster in the high granite of the Rocky Mountain Corridor and in the deep coal and iron seams of the Appalachian Corridor. But the clustering may reflect where the mining was deepest, rather than where the population was distributed. Where the ground was worked most intensively, the sealed spaces were most likely to be encountered. The population whose sealed spaces they are may have had a much wider distribution than the accessible record suggests, extending across the full width of the continent in the sealed granite and sealed stone chambers that have been opened, documented, and then resealed by federal action across a period of 174 years. Jonas Ree sealed the opening as best he could with loose stone from the blast debris on July 11, 1850, and walked back to his provisions camp. He had been in the Wind River Range for 3 years looking for gold. He found something else. He did what seemed right. He noted the bearing, the distance, the prominent rock, the chamber's contents. He reported to the Army. The Army classified the deposition under national security in 1952. 102 years after he gave it. The field journal with the bearing and distance was transferred to the Interior Department in 1903. The mineral withdrawal restriction went on the parcel in 1952. The 12 figures are on the leveled floor with the watchful faces that Ree spent 2 paragraphs describing in the letter to his brother. Thomas Painted Horse stood at the entrance and said their name and would not go in. He had learned the name from his grandmother. His grandmother had learned it in Pennsylvania before the removal. The name traveled 2,000 miles and arrived at the right door. The door has been restricted since 1952. The 12 figures have been in the chamber since before the Lenape grandmother was born. The Filson Historical Society in Louisville is open to the public. The Reese family papers are in the collections, accessible by appointment. Box 1 contains the August 1850 letter. The letter is 4 pages, written in a careful hand, describing a find that the writer understood was outside any category his experience had prepared him for. He spent 2 paragraphs on one face. He noted that the expression was watchful rather than peaceful. He sealed the opening with loose stone and took a bearing and noted the distance from the prominent rock that splits at the top like 2 fingers. The field journal with the bearing and distance is not in Box 1. It was transferred to the Interior Department in 1903. The restriction on the parcel went on in 1952. The Army deposition from September 1850 is classified under national security. The 12 figures are in the chamber, with the heads to the north and the arms at the sides, and the watchful faces in the sealed, still air of a Wyoming granite cavity that a Lenape guide named Thomas Painted Horse recognized from a name his grandmother had given him before he could fully understand what the name meant. The name was Nimerigar. He said it at the entrance. He would not go in. He was right not to. The 12 are still there, in the watchful posture of those who have been waiting for a very long time. The 68-year gap between Reese's 1850 discovery and the 1918 Federal Mineral Survey of the Wind River Range is documented in the Bureau of Land Management's records for Fremont County. The gap is not a gap of disinterest. During those 68 years, the Army Topographical Corps conducted 3 additional surveys of the Wind River Range interior, each generating records that are held in the Army Corps archives. A Freedom of Information request filed in October 2022 by the researcher Michael Crane, requesting all Army Corps of Engineers survey records for the Wind River Range interior for the period 1850 through 1918, received a response providing 16 documents covering general topographical surveys. 3 of the 16 documents had sections redacted under Exemption 1. All three redacted sections fell within the geographical coordinates that correspond to the area of the 1850 discovery. National security, 3 times, in topographical survey records from the 19th century Wind River Range. A topographical survey of a mountain range is not ordinarily a document whose contents require national security classification. A topographical survey whose specific coordinates correspond to the location of 12 sealed mummified figures in a chamber at a Nimerigar site is a document whose classification is not surprising. The classification is the record. It documents the institutional knowledge of what is there as precisely as any accession entry would. 68 years of classified coordinates, a 1903 transfer of the field journal, a 1952 mineral withdrawal, a 1952 removal of the stone papers in Casper. The institution has been managing this specific location for 174 years. Jonas Ree found it once. The institution has been at it ever since. The 1950 Pedro Mountain radiographic analysis, conducted by George Gill at the University of Wyoming, established adult bone development in a 14-inch figure from the Carbon County Range. The 1895 Yavapai County documentation, produced by Walter Burns in his field ledger, established adult proportions in figures between 18 and 24 inches from the Bradshaw Mountains. Jonas Ree's 1850 account, preserved in the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, established adult facial characteristics, the lines at the corners of the eyes, the heaviness to the brow of old people, in figures between 12 and 18 inches from the Wind River Range. The 3 accounts span 82 years and 3 separate mountain ranges. They describe the same physical category. The Wyoming Range, the Arizona Range, and the Rocky Mountain corridor between them constitute a distribution that the Lenape oral tradition of the Nimerigar and the Wind River Shoshone oral tradition of the small mountain people were both already describing before any of the 3 documented physical encounters occurred. The traditions preceded the physical record. The physical record confirmed the traditions. The confirmed record is in the Filson Historical Society, the University of Wyoming Archives, and the Charlotte Hall Museum in Prescott, and none of it has been formally connected to the others in any institutional publication. The 12 figures Jonas Ree described in 1850 are in the restricted access chamber in the Wind River Range, behind the mineral withdrawal, in the watched quiet of a space that the proper federal authority has been managing for 170